I was in Atlanta this week doing some recruiting for the Divinity School. My sister lives in Atlanta, and her husband is a pastor of the West Hunter Street Baptist Church in Atlanta, which is the church that Ralph Abernathy, Dr. King's good friend, used to pastor. It's a very, what I'll call a silk-stocking Southern church. The women still wear hats and, they still believe they're in the 50s in some ways, which my brother-in-law struggles. But we went to dinner on Friday night, and he was saying, well, I got to finish up my sermon tomorrow. And he said, what are you preaching on? And I said, you'll probably have the same reaction that my congregation will have. My title is, Are the Ten Commandments Still Relevant? And he said, what? How did you get to that? And so I'm sure some of you, when you saw the title, you said, are the Ten Commandments still relevant? What the what, Well, we are preaching through the Old Testament, and part of my goal in doing this is to not only make these texts a little more familiar to us. When we follow the lectionary, as I usually do except for summer, we are always given an Old Testament text, a psalm, a proverb, something from the Gospels, and usually something from the letters of Paul. Recently, we've been using the psalm as our call to worship, or at least portions of that week's psalm, again, just to get some of these texts more familiar in our hearing. The other really selfish thing is it's always a challenge to be given a text that you didn't choose yourself, but to pay attention and pray and see what God may be saying through that particular text. So when we think of the Ten Commandments, the first thing that pops into my mind is the infamous film starring Charlton Heston, Cecil B. DeMille. Most of us grew up watching that film. It came on like once a year. It still comes on like during Lent. And the balls of fire that come down from the mountain and are inscripted upon the stones. I was laughing at the picture that Carol put on the bulletin. One year when Mitchell was probably about 5, we were watching it on television, and he drew something that looks very similar to that. Little stones and the little scratchings, chicken scratchings on the front. One of my professors when I was in Divinity School, who was Jewish, taught a course called Introduction to the Hebrew Bible. And one of the things that he always said, in fact, the very first thing he said on the first day of class, was that this text is the story of a people and their God. And you must always remember that this story, from Genesis to Malachi, is really a story of the nation of Israel and their ups and downs, but it's a story of their relationship with their God in all its different stages and permeations. Many times as Christians, we want to say that the Old Testament itself is irrelevant, and we've been looking and listening to a video series by a well-known Old Testament professor, Amy Jill Levine, who teaches at Vanderbilt. And every week we marvel at how interesting she is. And someone said this morning, if any other person who wasn't a good storyteller were delivering this material, we'd all be bored out of our minds, right? There's a lot there, and as Christians, the point is not whether we are supposed to adhere to the laws of the Jews as handed down in the Old Testament, but rather, what do we learn about this God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? For Jesus was, after all, a Jew. This is the history of his people, and so much of what we have come to understand about who God is, about what justice means in the world, comes from these Jewish texts. When we talk about the Judeo-Christian ethic in American law and politics, that's what we mean. This notion of God who commands us in Deuteronomy to care for the widow and the orphan. And in the Ten Commandments, we sang Holy, Holy, Holy this morning because the first commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And there are things from these Ten Commandments that are not only part of us as Christians, they're part of the American understanding of right and wrong. There have been court battles fought over whether or not one can display the Ten Commandments in various public spaces. We won't get into that today, but I want to talk about what is God still saying? Is God still saying anything through the understanding of these particular 10 commandments? I have to Hold on, I'm not used to turning pages. As you know, I usually preach from my iPad, which died. Pray for my electronic life. It's not going too well right now. I lost a computer, hard disk, and now my iPad. But anyways, let me read for you some of these commandments. And we're familiar with these. Did anybody here have to memorize the 10 Commandments in Sunday school when you were growing up? Yeah, right? These are things that were just, yes sir, you line up. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. This is a central understanding to the Jewish people even today. It's not just the God who loves you, the God who calls you his own, but this is the God who brought you out of bondage. Passover rituals, so many rituals in the Jewish context begin with this understanding. I am the God who brought you out of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. The black slaves in America understood this story as one of aspiration. If God delivered Daniel, if God delivered the Hebrew slaves, then surely God will deliver us. This notion of God as a deliverer, as a God of freedom, and a God who cared enough about his people to bring him out of bondage is central to our understanding, even as Christians, of who God is. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol in any form. And we know that as soon as those commandments were given, Aaron and the people were at the base of the mountain waiting for Moses, and they got tired, and they threw in all of their gold earrings and all the things they had brought back from Egypt, and they made a golden calf. And so when Moses comes down the mountain and sees that they've made an idol in violation of this very law that God had just written on the tablets, he throws down the tablets, they crack, and he has to go back up the mountain. It's also important to understand what the Jewish notion of who God was and where he was is very important. We believe God is like everywhere, that we could be outside by a tree worshiping and we would still be in the presence of God. For them, God was this presence on the mountain. So at the end of the text, when they see the fire and the lightning, they're like, oh, Moses, we don't need to deal directly with that God. You talk to him. And then you talk to us, because we don't want to deal with this special effects kind of God that we see up on the mountain. But that was their understanding of who God was. And it wasn't until later in the wilderness when they erect a tabernacle, a tent, and God's cloud, they say, sits over the tabernacle, that they begin to have this notion that this is the place where God dwells. And God just can't be with us. He has to be in some little place. As Christians, we know the story that the temple veil was torn in two when Jesus was crucified, symbolizing getting rid of this notion that there's only one place where God is. God, we believe, is with us, in us, and is everywhere. So that's a very different understanding, but this particular commandment talks about not making anything more important to us than God is. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God. Boy, how many times have we said something wrong within the Lord's name, taking the Lord's name in vain? How many of us were raised with that admonition, right? Not supposed to do that, not polite language. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. We have groups of Christians who think that Saturday is the Sabbath. And really, do you know why we worship on Sunday? It's not because we think Sunday is the Sabbath or the day of rest. It's because it's the day that Jesus was resurrected. It was called the Lord's Day. And so the early Christians who were Jewish kept the Sabbath, but they also got together on Sunday, the first day of the week. I do believe that it's important for us to have a sense of Sabbath, which means that we need rest at some point. This is my new mantra. Rest sanctifies. I keep telling myself that. Rest prepares and enables us to do the things that we need to do. Our personnel committee, every year when they do my review, they remind me that I need to take care of myself and get plenty of rest. And I have been trying to do a better job of that over the last couple of years. But the notion that there is some place and time where we should rest, whether it's on Saturday or any other day, is still important. We're not being held accountable for keeping Sabbath, although there are people who do that. We have lots of Jewish students and faculty at the Divinity School, and we have to be careful not to have programs on Friday night or on days when there are other holy days. There are some non-Christians who find the need to keep those particular time frames holy. And so God, in our Christian context, is not calling us to that kind of rest, but He is calling us to rest, to just take care of ourselves and to observe a time of worship together, not so much for His sake as for our sake, that it's important that we take care of ourselves. Here's perhaps my favorite one: honor thy father and thy mother. And I really like what it says after it: so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. I often used to hear my grandmother add that tagline on. It's important not just to honor your mother and father, but that so you can live a long and happy life if you don't. You shall not commit adultery. No one would argue with that. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shouldn't lie. You shouldn't covet your neighbor's house, his wife, or slave, or ox, or anything else that is your neighbor's. Those are things that we have laws now to protect. You can get a divorce on the grounds of adultery pretty easily. You can go to jail if you steal. If you're caught lying, particularly in court, there are penalties. We all would consider these things just to be decent ways of being in the world, whether or not they were written down in the Ten Commandments at all. So, what, if anything, is still relevant about these commandments? Well, I mentioned that these concepts, these values, are so infused in American society that even though if you never read the Ten Commandments, you would find that these are major principles in American society. Interestingly enough, when Jesus was asked by the Pharisees who were trying to trick him, which of the commandments is the greatest? This was a society where you could be punished, where they believed if you didn't follow God's laws, if you didn't give proper sacrifice, that you would be zapped from heaven, that your children, your animals, and your livestock, bad things would happen to you if you didn't obey these laws. Jesus responds and says, well, of course, the first is to love the Lord your God. There's no question about that. But the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. And in reality, isn't what the rest of those commandments are about? Not lying, cheating, or stealing is another way of saying, be good to one another. Don't do things that would hurt one another. Jesus replies and teaches them everything that God holds important. And that's to take care of one another, but to do so as a response to our love for God. If we love God, surely we will love our neighbor. That's not always the case, but hopefully that's the aspiration that we have as Christians. We love God so much that we follow the example that Jesus has taught. And Jesus' example was to not only love, but to sacrifice for one another, to include one another, no matter who we are, where we come from, what we look like, to make sure that we are paying attention to those whom God has created, to honor their humanity in whatever form that humanity takes. Jesus set an example for loving God by honoring our neighbor. And so as we begin our annual stewardship campaign, I'm sure you were wondering, how is she going to wrap all this stuff together? It is from our commitment to that love of God and that commitment to love our neighbor that we approach how we give our time, our talent, and our treasure. Around this time of year and all the little electronic newsletters that I subscribe to, there's always some little reflection by ministers floating around. And I subscribe to the Grace Institute newsletter, the Grace Institute run and led by my good friend Michelle Jinks and her husband Roger Jinks, who were formerly the pastors of, he was formerly the pastor of Grace Community Church. And his little note about giving sort of confirmed that, or at least I'll say I agreed with him. He talked about the fact that too many times people are just trying to fill holes in budgets in churches. And it is important, of course, and we will be doing this later in the week. You have, for the last few years, been receiving a budget that the church board is proposing so that you can understand the needs of our church, where the gaps are. It's better, we felt, to do that than to pretend as though, oh, we're flowing in milk and honey. We are in many ways flowing in milk and honey. But we want you to see exactly where we are, both in terms of our accountability to you and just to be transparent. You will know where the need is, and hopefully you will commit what resources you can to doing this faithful work. Well, the other thing that Roger said in his note is that it's important to give people a vision, a reason why, something that we know that is beyond us. And as we've been studying in our prayer study on Wednesdays during Feed the Body and Soul, and as you've heard me talk so often about honing the circle maker, I believe that we must yield all the visions and dreams that we have for our church and submit them to prayer, focused, intentional prayer. And how will we do this if we don't know what we're praying for? Habakkuk 2:2-3 says, I will stand at the watchpost and station myself. I will keep watch to see what God will say to me and what he will answer me concerning my request. And then Habakkuk the prophet hears from God, and God says to him, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so that a runner may read it. For there is still a vision for the appointed time. It speaks of the end and does not lie. If it seems to tarry, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. The ideas, the dreams, the visions that we have for more people, more programs, more children, more young families, more resources to do more work in the community, more people spending time in prayer and Bible study on Wednesday night, more people coming to Sunday school on Sunday, more presence in the community as we seek to be the presence of Christ. Hopefully, as we move through our stewardship campaign and then on to our planning for the following year, we will understand that it's not going to be enough just to meet the bills. It's never enough just to meet the bills because we're a church. We could operate without this building. We could find some free space to meet in every week, and we could rid ourselves of a lot of things. You could get a volunteer minister. You could get a volunteer pianist, a choir director. There are lots of churches who operate that way. So the bills are one thing, but the vision is another. Who we want to be. We've just celebrated 50 years, and we are going to be looking at some strategic thinking about this church going forward in a very new sort of way, because we have to be able to see ourselves as something beyond what we are today in order that there is a legacy, a church, a ministry to pass on to those who will follow us. And it is very selfish not to think about those who will follow us, for none of us in this room will be here always. Some of us will probably be here longer than others, but we have to think about what God wants us to leave. And so I submit to you that when I'm asking, and I said it in the newsletter, and I've been saying it every Wednesday night, for what do you think God wants? What can you see? A project. Somebody mentioned the other Wednesday night of having a food pantry. We're going to ask those people to help with pads too, Jim and Joy. So you might enjoy that. Someone spoke of having a certain number of people baptized within a given time frame. I talked about seeing some of the people from Spirituality on Tap actually come to our church. That has happened, at least one person anyway. There are other things that we think we might do, other projects, other ways of being, new ways of doing music, new ways of doing Bible study. We need to name it and define it, and then pray about it. If we don't write the vision clear and understand what it is that we want to do, it will be hard for us to kind of line up behind that vision and move forward together. And whatever we decide to do, I believe firmly that we need to bathe it and circle it and cover it in prayer. God will hear us. In that same chapter where Jesus is asked, what's the great commandment? The two blind men by the side of the road ask, Lord, heal us. We want to see. That's in response to the question that Jesus asked them, what do you want me to do for you? So as we begin Stewardship Month, Jesus is asking us, what do you want me to do for you? And the answers that we give, I want us to write boldly. Write it clearly so that we all understand, and in a collective process we can decide what those priorities are. And then we can begin to use our time, our talents, and our treasure together to make these things happen. We are going to have the opportunity, a few of us, to hear from Mark Batterson, who wrote the book, The Circle Maker. Can you imagine how excited I was to get this email? I've been talking about this book forever, that he's going to be at a prayer breakfast, or a lunch actually, on Friday. And a few of us are going to hear him. This is a young man who has built a huge ministry simply because he has a disciplined approach to prayer. He's inspired me. I hope he's been inspiring people in Wednesday night. But I really do believe that we have to get our vision, make it clear to ourselves, not in some big sprawling fashion, but choosing a few things that we want to do over the next few years. Ask God to bless it. Pray hard, pray consistently and fervently, and then watch what God will do if we work like everything depends on us, but pray like everything depends on God. Are the 10 Commandments still relevant? Loving God, loving our neighbor is at the heart of who we are as God's people. Those things will never change. God's calling us in new ways of doing it, being church. We need everything you are, everything you have, everything you can bring to the work. Write the vision plain that all of us may run